All right, you ready for a little America-Spain social studies? So yesterday, this kind of came up when we were walking. There were some people who were doing the Camino by horseback, and I said, actually, the horses came from Spain. They were not native to the United States, which is partially true, but I'm gonna tell you. Okay, so horses had actually originated in the Americas, but they went extinct before the Native Americans got to the Americas. So the Native Americans did not have horses before Christopher Columbus arrived. So in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, so he was an explorer, right? Christopher Columbus was a cartographer. He was a map maker, and he was Italian. But he had this idea that he could get to India a different route. So at the time, the only way that they could get to India was by going all the way around Africa or going through the desert, like the Middle East, to get there. And both of those routes were not easy. And so since he was a map maker and he understood the world a little bit better than most people, he knew that if he sailed west, he could get east, but he had a hard time getting anybody to buy into it, and he didn't have the money to do it himself. So he was trying to look for a country that could finance this trip that he wanted to do, right? And so he goes to the Queen and King of Spain, which at the time was Isabella and Ferdinand. And he went to them and said, hey, I got this idea, if I sail west, then I can get to India east. And they were trying to get to India because that's where all the spices and gold were. Spices were used to make medicine at the time. And so Queen and King of Spain were at the point where they were like in their exploration era, and they also wanted to control that trade route. And so they said, okay, fine, we'll give you the boats, we'll give you the crew, as long as you sail under the Spanish flag, and anything that you conquer, you put it in the name of Spain. And he was like, okay, cool, that's a deal. So he got his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and he sails west. And he was right, of course, about the fact that he would get east eventually, but his mistake was that he thought that the earth was much smaller than it was. And he also thought that the earth only consisted of the continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia. He didn't have any concept of North, South America, because they had never been over there. So he's sailing. And of course, there's no motorboats at the time. So it was just, they had to kind of follow the trade winds. And he ends up in the Bahamas. And he thought that he was in India. So he meets the Taino people, and he's like, y'all are Indians, because he thought he was in India, and he didn't know what Indian people looked like. And so the Tainos were wearing a lot of gold, and actually they were pretty welcoming and they were pretty friendly once they realized that he wasn't like some alien, because you got to understand that they had never met people that looked like Christopher Columbus and his crew. These are people that have like blonde hair, blue eyes, like they look completely different than the natives. So he acted kind of friendly at first because he knew that he wanted their land, and he ended up leaving some of his crew and then going back to Spain. And he met up with the king and queen, and he was like, hey, I did not find a new trade route, but I found something even better. I found new land, and yes, there's people on there, but they're timid, and they are also trusting, and we can take them. And so he was really saying that because he knew that the Native Americans didn't have the same type of weapons that the Europeans had at the time. And he knew that if enough of them came over, that they could take over the land. And so, of course, that's exactly what happened. Once they came over, once they got word that there was this quote-unquote unoccupied land, everybody wanted a piece. And they came over and they started conquering the Native Americans' land. But back to the part about the horses, because that's where I started. The Columbian Exchange began at that point. So the Columbian Exchange just refers to things that the Americas had that Spain didn't, and vice versa. And one of those things was domesticated horses. So the horses came over, and the Native Americans now had access to horses, but then they started losing their land. So not a very good trade-off, don't you think? And that's your social studies lesson with Miss Youngblood for the day.